Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's show. I'm your host, Jacob Hansen, and joining me today is my good friend and co-host, Hayden Carroll. Hayden,
Hey.
how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. Thanks for joining in. Been a while since we've been doing this, but glad we've been able to make it happen.
Absolutely.
So today, everybody, I wanted to go in and discuss with Hayden a video that my brother made, my brother Forrest, on his channel, Latter Day Skeptic. For those of you who don't know, I have a younger brother who has essentially an anti-religious, sort of anti-Mormon channel, although he focuses more on religion more generally. And yeah, we kind of go back and forth. We have a good relationship, but we do critique one another every once in a while in our videos. And anyway, Hayden, I wanted to get your thoughts on some of this video. So
Sure. Looking forward
anyway,
to it.
So in this video, he kind of hits on three different points. It's all about, the title of the video is Religion Thrives on Three False Beliefs. Okay. And one of the ones he's going to deal with first is this concept of where essentially we say, well, how can you have morality, or how can you believe in anything besides just matter in motion, right? That how can you have morality in a world that's nothing but material in motion with that kind of a worldview? And so he makes kind of a response to that. Now, I'm going to actually go through his points in a different order than he makes them, specifically because as I watched this video, I realized he actually stumbles into something really interesting. Okay. So we'll kind of go through it, and Hayden, I'll get your thoughts on some of it. So
Sure.
let me play this first clip, and we'll rock and roll with it.
Principle that allows the world to have complexity. Without it,
So real quick, he's talking about emergence. Just want to make sure everyone understands this.
thing we see in the world. Shocking. Emergence is the underlying principle that allows the world to have complexity. Without it, the world would only consist of atoms doing what atoms do.
And this is what we call the phenomenon of emergence, the idea that there's more than one way of talking about how the universe works. There's a way that might be the most fundamental. Maybe that has to do with atoms and particles and quantum mechanics. But then there's higher level ways, emergent levels in the macroscopic reality that we perceive every day, that still tell us something true and useful about the world, even though our information about it is radically incomplete.
With this principle in mind, it opens an avenue for how complex life can emerge from simple structures. It opens the door to how we could have developed complex moral systems. It opens the door for how we could develop a sensation that feels like free will. I'm not saying I know how these complexities develop, but rather I'm saying that it's common in our existence to see simple process develop into complex systems. And
okay. So let's let you kind of, if you want to try and steelman what he's saying for a second, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. So what's your impression of what he's getting at?
Correct me if I'm wrong. What I understand him saying is that just because something is complex doesn't mean it needs a designer, right? That's the ultimate argument of emergence, right?
Sort of, yes. And I would say more so that you'll say this. You'll say, look, here's the way I'd frame it to kind of steelman him. So I'll play Forrest here for a minute. Hayden, you'll make the claim that, like, how can you get morality out of just atoms in motion, right? Like, how do you derive an ought from an is, right? The universe just is, it's just a bunch of material running around. And he is going to respond to that and say, essentially, well, it's the principle of emergence, right? Out of small things, you get more complex things that have new properties, right?
Okay.
And so what he's driving at here, and the thing that was really interesting was the part about, I think it was Sean Carroll is the name of the scientist that he quotes, that talks about how, yeah, we can talk about the universe in terms of atoms at the most fundamental level, but we can also talk about it in terms of more complex things, right? Like the way our bodies work, and then the way that people interact with one another. And so there's sort of multiple layers to reality. And this is what I found so interesting about what Forrest is saying. So reductive materialism is to reduce everything down to say it all ultimately is just matter in motion. Forrest is actually rebelling against reductive materialism and is basically talking about what, let's just call it for the sake of this video, the emergent world, right? This world that emerges from these simple things that are interacting with each other. What we might call, if you're going to say, okay, well, what is reality? Well, you can talk about reality in terms of matter and motion, but as Sean Carroll, that scientist, was saying, you can also talk about the world at different levels of analysis. And so the materialist tends to kind of boil everything down and say the only thing that's really real is the matter in motion. But Forrest,
he's saying no.
Exactly. That's what's funny. Forrest is stumbling into what Jordan Peterson and other people talk about when they say, life is not like reality isn't ultimately matter. It's what matters.
I'm not an atheist anymore because I don't look at the world that way anymore. I'm not a materialist anymore. I don't think the world's made out of matter. I think it's made out of what matters. It's made out of meaning. Look at it from the perspective of modern brain science. What we orient towards unconsciously, which means what captures our attention, is meaning, and it captures our attention before we know what it is. The brain acts as if the world's made out of information or made out of meaning. Heidegger, for example, German philosopher, was convinced that the world was made out of meaning, essentially, and that people's primary interaction with being was interaction with meaning. And that isn't what modern people think because they're deeply materialistic. If you go back 400 years or 500 years and you look at what people meant when they said matter, which is what things are made out of, what they thought matter was isn't like what we think it is. It wasn't like this material stuff, sort of like dirt that everything was made out of. It was much more complicated than that. The problem with the standard view of matter is that it doesn't really deal with the fact that matter comes in arrays and in patterns. And the patterns and the arrays, which is sort of lost when you think about atoms, that's where all the action is. That's where the reality is.
There's a more fundamental way of analyzing the world, because if you see the world just as we're just a bunch of atoms moving around in chemical reactions, that's a totally different thing than this. It's true, but it's not the whole picture. It doesn't describe all of reality at kind of all of these layers of analysis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and so you're saying Forrest is agreeing with that there are layers.
Yes, he's basically saying he's moving away from, in this video, the notion of reductive materialism. He's describing what I'm going to call the emergent world. And if I were to ask you, well, what is actually real, Hayden? And you're a reductive materialist, well, what is real?
The things that I can observe.
The things that you touch. And what are those things ultimately? Like
material,
what are
atoms.
You're right. It's atoms, it's quarks, it's whatever it's just stuff. It's little things, and they move around and touch each other. And that's the reductive materialist view. But Forrest is saying that's not all there is to reality. And you and I are sitting here going,
exactly.
That's the point. And so I think this is a good segue into where he talks about metaphorical truth. Okay. Because if we're going to talk about what's true, which is kind of the thing here, we want to talk about what is truth. Truth is that which pertains to reality. I'm going to say that again. Truth is that which pertains to reality. But that leads us to the question, well, what is reality? If you're going to define reality as just matter, that's the only thing that's real, well, then you're ignoring the emergent world. But if you say that reality includes all of the emergent properties of the universe that emerge from these things, then you have something very different when you're talking about that which pertains to the emergent reality that exists. So I was getting a little crazy philosophical.
Does he? No, this is good. Does he say in that last third of his video on that topic of emergence, does he say what those other levels are, or does he just leave it to Sean Carroll to kind of?
Yeah, no, he doesn't. He doesn't get into that. He basically says, though, a critique of that religious people make and that Christians will make oftentimes, and I make it, is that if you are a reductive materialist, if you believe the only thing that is real is matter in motion, then you deny the reality of things like morality, like consciousness.
And he's saying, I don't.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's saying, no, there's emergence. And I'm saying, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he doesn't realize that he's actually moving towards the religious camp, because the religious camp, if you're going to talk about religion in the most broad terms, is a discussion about the nature of the emergent world, the world and the things that can't be reduced to merely chemical
Atoms.
reactions and matter and physics,
Mhm.
right? What we might call a spiritual reality.
Another
Right.
level. Yep. Mhm.
Exactly. Something that
we could even say that the physical emerges from the spiritual.
that's a particular point of view that is espoused by some, and that's a whole other thing. But again, if you watch this video in one order, it seems like I'm basically taking him from the end to the beginning, and it shows what is going on with this. So I'm gonna go into this idea. He says, so the other thing he's attacking, this false belief of religion, is that we conflate truth with metaphorical truth. Okay. So I'm going to play a clip here where he talks about that. Let me just get it queued up time wise, and then we will start with that. Okay. Let me pull this up. And here we go.
Health nonetheless. Jordan Peterson is famous for this type of metaphorical thinking, and I'll call this type of argument the metaphorical truth argument. It's a very simple idea. There are metaphors that can convey some lessons that, if followed, produce desired results, even if the story itself is completely false.
The argument you got into with Sam Harris about the nature of truth, and since I heard that, I've been sort of itching to have this conversation with you, because I think there's a way of viewing this that will actually perhaps reconcile the 2 points of view, but there's a bitter pill that comes along with it. So here's my argument. We tend to think of intellect as having evolved because knowing what's true gives you an advantage. But there's actually nothing that says that the literal truth is where advantage lies. And so I have a category that I call literally false, metaphorically true. These are ideas that aren't true in the factual sense, but they are true enough that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you would be if you behaved according to the fact that they're not true. So let me give you a couple of trivial examples that won't be controversial. Porcupines can throw their quills. It's not true. However, if you live near porcupines and you imagine that porcupines can throw their quills, you'll give them some space. If you don't, you may, realizing that they can't throw their quills, get really close to one, and it may wheel around and nail you with a porcupine quill, which can be extremely dangerous because they are microscopically designed to move in from where they puncture you over time, and they can puncture a vital organ, or you can get an infection. So the person who believes that a porcupine can throw their quills has an advantage that isn't predicated on the fact that this is actually a literal truth.
This porcupine analogy has a very simple explanation. What's true is that if you are cautious around porcupines, you'll be safer. But it's false to say that porcupines can throw their quills. This concept of metaphorical arguments, whenever we hear them.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. So, do you get what he's saying there? Any thoughts? Any questions about it?
Yeah, I'm wondering what his critique is of it. Does he go on to say that that's not a good way to live, or what's his?
So it's interesting because what he's trying to say is that the essentially what he says is that
We use things that are false to bring about good things. That's not actually the truth.
He's saying it isn't actually true, is kind of what he's saying.
Mm-hmm.
What he's doing is he actually is bouncing back to being a reductive materialist, right? Because he's saying that, it isn't true, really. because the only things that are true are those things which are provable scientifically. You can
interesting.
weigh them in it. And that's why I'm doing
So
this in reverse.
you're saying he's rejecting emergence at this point.
He's rejecting the tools that we often use to describe and understand the emergent world, right? So now I'm not saying that every scriptural story and everything in the scriptures is metaphorical truth and none of it is actually real, but there's a real debate about how literal everything is in scripture versus things that are more allegorical. And the thing is, but there's an immediate rejection of the allegorical as, well, it's not true. And there's a problem with that, because if the allegories are indeed true, metaphorically true, as Forrest would say, well, what if they're describing that emergent world? What if that is the way that we understand the things that don't fit into a test tube as a reductive materialist? Now, again, just going to step back and say, look, I'm not someone who believes that. I'm not a Jordan Peterson person who believes that it's all just metaphor that helps us psychologically to advance in the world. Like, that's not what I believe. I believe there are real, like, truths about the nature of even the physical world that are encapsulated in our teachings. However, not always. I do believe that much in scripture is indeed not literal, or doesn't need to be literal, or its purpose isn't to be literal, or it's based in actual events, but that it's been mythologized in some way or metaphorized in some way in order to teach a more fundamental principle. Because the purpose of the scriptures ultimately isn't to give you a scientific account of everything. It's to give you a more fundamental description. And if you were right, like you had said, where the physical emerges from something more spiritual in nature, then maybe that would mean that the metaphorical truths are more true than the physical truths.
Give me an example of, like, is that the guy talking, Jordan Peterson? Is that Weinstein? Who is that?
Yeah, I think it's Brett. I think it's Brett Weinstein.
Yeah.
Or is it Brett? I think it's his brother. I can't remember.
Yeah.
Anyway. No, Eric's his brother. That was Brett.
So his example of the porcupine, basically even the principle that if you believe that a porcupine can throw its quill, that'll save you trouble, even though that's not true. That will actually benefit you more if you believed that falsity. Is there an example that you think Forrest would point to, let's say in Mormonism, that he would compare the same thing? Because maybe I'm misunderstanding his point. Is he saying that's a bad thing to believe things that are not true?
I think what he's saying is that remember his video is 3 false ideas that religions thrive on, and one of the false ideas is what he calls metaphorical truth. Do you see the contradiction?
Yeah,
I'm saying metaphorically true, but he's retreating. That's why I brought up the emergence thing first. He put it at the end of his video, but he didn't realize that idea of emergence actually contradicts what he's talking about. Because the idea of emergence is the idea that not everything can be reduced to scientific truth. And that's exactly what metaphorical truth deals in. It deals in the realm, like when Jesus gave a parable or something, that parable wasn't literally true. It was metaphorically true in order to teach you a principle that will lead you towards greater life and salvation. So, okay. So are you saying he has an issue with teaching truth through parables, or like, what's the issue here? No, that's the thing. He in the video, he even says, like, I'm not saying you can't use the Bible to like teach good moral lessons. But again, there's the problem is how he's defining what is true and what is false. He doesn't clarify that.
So I'm confused about what he's.
And you're right to be confused, because there's a contradiction. Because he talks about metaphorical truth, but then says that it's false. Well, yeah, we know that's why these things are called metaphors or myths or whatever. They teach you, but they're still true in a sense that they teach you about the nature of the emergent world, of the what we might call a spiritual reality. And what's funny is you have to ask yourself, well, what is more real? Your conscious experience of the world, or the stuff that your consciousness encounters? And in my opinion, and this is sort of the opinion of sort of those that are existentially or phenomenologically based in their thinking, is that what is most real isn't what is
It's
out
the
there.
experience.
It's the experience of it. And
Mhm.
so to understand the nature of consciousness and the nature of this emergent world is actually the more fundamental way of understanding reality. And
So in a sentence, what's his critique? What's his issue with this?
it's false. And people use it to Jesus smuggle and to bring and to justify their religious beliefs because they think that they're and maybe there is something to grant a little bit of ground here, that religious people will say that metaphorical truths are literally true.
Okay. So is he presupposing that all religion is false? Is
Yes.
he bringing that to the table?
Yeah, for
He's
sure.
saying all of this is false, and if you say it's true, then you're lying. And is he
Yeah,
saying
it's
that?
or you're just naive and mistaken and can't see things the way they really are. But again, with the principle of the emergent world, it's like, well, what if religion is talking about the emergent world that doesn't even have access to your scientific instruments?
Mhm.
Now, I don't make that claim that the church has nothing to say about the actual natural physical world. Like, I believe that. But I think the church is actually talking about the whole thing. I think the gospel,
Sure.
I think that spirituality and religion it's meant to encompass all of it.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. The
And
spiritual realm, right? There's no material that's immaterial, and there's nothing physical that's not created spiritually. All things are spiritual before him. I mean, it's plain in the text.
it's definitely part of our religious tradition, unlike others, which very much create a very sharp line between sort of there's the spiritual world and then there's the physical world, where we're kind of like, they're kind of all meshed together. And so anyway,
Okay.
now the next one. So his issue is his first contention that we dealt with is that religious people don't understand emergence, and that's why they thrive on this idea that atheists are dumb because they just believe in materiality, but there's this other stuff that emerges from it, which again is kind of ironic. His second one that he brings up is this metaphorical truth isn't literally true, and so religious people try and make their metaphorical truths and treat them as though they're actually real. And again, it's sort of like, depends what you mean by real. And then the fruits alone epistemology. So let's go to that one kind of as this was actually the beginning of his video. And we'll watch a little bit about this. Actually, we'll just start right from the beginning with this one because it starts pretty early. Actually, no, wait. I'll start it right here. Okay, let me pull this up.
Let's call out these false arguments whenever we hear them. Let's start off with one of the most famous arguments used by Mormons. Have you ever had a debate with a Mormon that inevitably drifted into comparing lifestyles of believers and non-believers? I don't know, maybe something like this. Yeah, that's right. The first false argument is, by their fruits ye shall know them.
Joseph Smith declared that his work was the Lord's work. His credentials as a prophet of God are not adequately tested by historical relics. The fruits of the restored gospel of Jesus Christ are the real test of Joseph and his work.
This kind of thinking was the basis for my testimony. I would say things like, I have a testimony of the Young Men's Program because of the way it has personally helped my life. Or I have a testimony of the Word of Wisdom because I see the benefits in my health. But as I got older, I realized that this is not a valid epistemology. And to explain why, let me give.
So what's his? I'll let you kind of give your analysis on what he's saying.
He's saying many Mormons, including himself when he was younger, would say that if your life is better, then that means it's true, or that's an evidence that it's true. And he's saying as he got older, he started to realize that someone's life can be better and they may not be a Mormon. So how is it a reliable source of truth if that's the only thing that we're using, which it's not, but I don't know if that's the only thing he ever used, or his, like the testimony of the young men's program. Like, I don't see anything wrong with somebody saying, I know how beneficial this is. Right. But we don't say the young men's program is true. Like, I don't understand that comparison of saying I have a testimony. What does that mean to have a testimony of the young men's program?
Well, and that's I think he makes a point that I think can be considered as valid here. If someone says, I had a great experience in the young men's program, therefore the Hill Cumorah is located in South America.
Sure.
It's like, or therefore the Jaredites used these exact types of barges. No,
Sure.
like that's not and he's right to point that out. And if someone is using a feelings alone epistemology, or in this case, this wouldn't be a feelings alone. This is a
By fruits alone.
Fruits alone. Basically, you say, well, because this, and he's right to point out. He points out it's a false cause, right? You're saying that this because of it's a non sequitur. It's because I feel good about this, therefore every claim that the church makes is true.
Sure. But who does that? Does anyone do that?
Well, I don't know. Maybe some people do. And I don't want to ever say that there aren't people out there that can be that ignorant. However, he's kind of misrepresenting what people are saying when they believe in certain things because of it. If I have a testimony of the young men's program, that's just a witness that this thing has in some way spiritually enriched my life. It has had an effect on this emergent world that is aligning with what I think is spiritually healthy and good. Like, I've found something good. If you're looking for God, you're looking for goodness, you're looking for truth, you're looking for righteousness. And when you find things that comport to those things, to what you might hold as the highest good or as the divine, and you say that,
you have to have a standard before you can judge something.
Yes. But at the same time, whatever that is, when you say that something is aligning with that, it's true in the sense that it's telling me something about that. It's somehow connected to it. Like, we have experiences in our life that we can only describe in terms of it was divine. It enlarged my soul. Language oftentimes has a hard time describing this emergent reality that exists as conscious beings, right? And so we believe, as Latter-day Saints, we have a description for what this sort of emergent world is. And so we will use language to describe something as aligning with God, or being, God is the truth. This thing aligns with that. And therefore it is true in that sense. It's true in the sense that I've learned something about the emergent nature of reality because of this thing. It's taught me truth, right? And maybe those truths are hard to articulate, right? Maybe they are, but you've gotten something deep out of the experience. So,
and would you say he's kind of straw man, like you said, he's kind of misrepresenting what people are saying and what the church teaches, right? Because this whole "by their fruits you shall know them," this is not a Mormon thing. Like, Jesus said this. Like, if you believe the Bible is authoritative and accurate, it was Jesus.
Yeah, but he's attacking all religious tradition. So he's saying that, look, just because your church produces better outcomes doesn't mean that Joseph Smith saw God.
Right. And
now,
we would agree with that.
I would agree. That's not the argument. But what it does tell us is, if I were seeking, what am I seeking? What are you seeking? What are we all seeking? You're seeking to fill your soul with that truth about the metaphysical realm, the emergent realm, as you might call it. And when you find something that brings about spiritual light into your life, that enlarges your soul, that is like, ooh, this, like, what's the word we're going to use? Well, this is spiritually true. It's rich. It's goodness. It's truth. It's light. We use these words because they're hard to describe. Like, again, we use metaphors to convey a deeper reality that words have a very hard time encapsulating. And so, yes, there exists scientific truth, but there also exists what we might call spiritual truth. And how do you detect spiritual truth? Well, and then what you're testifying of is you're testifying of an encounter with something that was part of that deeper spiritual truth that exists in this emergent realm that Forrest acknowledges exists.
Like the young men's program, or like some aspect of the church that's not directly related to the truth claims of the foundation of God and Jesus Christ and Joseph Smith as the prophet.
Yes, not directly, but I will say indirectly. Here's what I mean. There's this really great analogy I like called the green light prophet. You might have heard me say it before. I'm not sure if you have, but I'm going to tell the audience about it. The basic idea is this. Let's say that you had a guy who came up to you on the street and was like, hey, you're going to hit all green lights on your way to work today. And you go, okay. And you drive to work and you hit all green lights. Okay. Maybe it was a fluke. But let's say that guy came to you and said, you're going to hit all green lights for the next month. And you did. You hit all green lights. And then you said, okay, what if he said for a year? What if he said for 2 years? What if he said for 5 years? And this guy, and you hit all green lights every time. You would start to view this person as, okay, they're trustworthy. They seem to have something figured out. Something is going on here, right? And so when you have somebody like a Joseph Smith, who's an ignorant farm kid with no special anything really, who suddenly begins to tell you these things and organize things that if you live by them, deeply enrich your soul and your life, and you're a believer that there's some sort of a higher power in the universe, it is not irrational to begin to go, maybe there's something to this. Maybe there's some kind of a, at least metaphorical truth that this guy has connected with. And he comes to you and says, well, I saw God and, this all happened. Again, there's a level to which fruits establish someone as a trustworthy source. And in this case, we're talking about the spiritual realm. Who are authorities in the spiritual realm? Who are the authorities on the emergent realm? I can tell you who the authorities are about the scientific realm. They're the world's leading physicists, chemists, biologists. They have a very good understanding of the way that the physical properties of the universe work. But who are the experts on this emergent world? And when I have somebody like a Joseph Smith who has over and over shown themselves to be, and I would say, wouldn't just say Joseph, I'd say all of the prophets of God, the entire Judeo-Christian tradition, the biblical tradition, that this is what Jordan Peterson points out. He's like, there's immense wisdom in this. Now he says it's all, well, he doesn't say it, but he leans towards, it's metaphorical. Let's just assume it's all metaphor. These are really amazing metaphorical truths. And I say, yes, Jordan, exactly. And they're not the only ones. Like, read the Book of Mormon. Read what Joseph Smith taught. Look at the practical spiritual effects that these things have, and you will realize that they fit into they deserve the same authoritative mantle as those other people.
Sure. And from a neutral standpoint, yes. From a Protestant standpoint, no, because we are contradicting what has already been established as those metaphorical truths, right? And I know we're not talking about Protestantism,
and we can have no more of those metaphorical truths.
Yeah,
we're all given.
But I'd be curious, and maybe you, me, and Forrest will have to chat one of these days on what he thinks about that metaphor, about that emergent world. Like, what's his take on what is it? How can we know about it? Like, what's his experience in the emergent world? Because I don't know. I don't know him well enough to know how he might respond.
Yeah, no, I'd be very curious as well. And so that's kind of where I wanted to leave it. He talks about these false beliefs that religions thrive on, but he also recognizes that essentially there's a spiritual realm or an emergent realm, and that realm can be described by metaphorical truths. And then he points out as his third point, kind of that, yeah, fruits alone epistemology doesn't work. And I'm like, yeah, I know.
Yep.
But there is something to be said when someone seems to be able to have either an understanding or a connection to deeper truths that that seem to accurately describe the nature of the emergent reality that we live in.
So let me push back, play devil's advocate for your green light prophet analogy or authority.
Uh-huh.
So realistically, practically speaking, that would never happen, right? And you're also not saying that there's any person who can be 100% right all of the time, because I don't even think you believe Joseph Smith was right 100% of the time.
No.
So what if for this green light analogy, what if this guy said you were going to hit green lights for a year, and you hit green lights 95% of the time, but 5% of the time he was wrong?
Yep.
So is he still trustworthy to dedicate your entire life to serve him and do what he's asking you to do? Or how do you deal with the fallibility issue? Because you've kind of described an infallible guy.
Let me, well, first of all, I would say that the guy is still highly reliable, right? I still think that if you follow his advice, let's modify the analogy slightly. He gives you directions to drive each day, and you hit green lights 95% of the time. The question isn't, okay, was he perfect? The question is, well, who else is giving out directions and who's giving better directions?
Yeah, I think that's a better way to say it.
Who's hitting more green lights? See, this is one of the things, and I bring this up a lot with people. It's called the utopian comparison. And this is a fallacy that people make all the time. They say, well, like the United States, right? You'll have these critiques. Oh, this is a terrible country. You have to ask, compared to what? Like, oh, Joseph's full of crap. Really?
Compared to
on
what?
Spiritual matters, compared to who? Who gave better spiritual advice than Joseph Smith? You know what I mean? And obviously, I want to be very careful, because I think you could probably find other people in the Christian tradition that are probably up there in his ballpark when it comes to spiritual truth.
Sure, but he didn't have a monopoly on teaching truth. That's also not our claim either.
Yeah, no, and that's part of it. But the basic idea here is it's just the nature of authority. Again, we're getting into sort of the collective witnesses, right? Authority
I don't really care
by outcomes.
I don't really care if there's better theologians than Joseph. That's fine if people can tap into the wisdom. He was no more entitled to receive revelation on spiritual things than we were. Now, he had stewardship where he could receive it on particular topics that we or nobody else can. But yeah, I agree.
Well, and what he brought to the world was certainly something unique that's had an immense positive impact in my estimation, like hugely so.
Yeah, is there any
way underestimated?
Yeah, are there any other? I mean, there are probably lots of people who fit that category, but like, is there another example of a Joseph Smith, like Muhammad? Maybe not within
the Christian tradition. You know, at the end of the day, I believe in Joseph because I'm a Christian. So what am I looking for? I'm looking for the people. I'm looking for Christ's church, right? I'm looking for that, and I have to. Again, I can compare it against utopia and say, like, okay, where is this perfect group of people that are perfectly aligned with Jesus Christ and leaders that never say anything but what's perfectly true? Obviously, you're never going to find that.
Well, it's in the Bible, didn't you know? Sola Scriptura. It's perfect.
Exactly. So that is essentially the issue. So when it comes to fruits alone, again, I covered this in my own epistemology video. No single witness, and fruits being kind of results or outcomes, yeah, that doesn't stand alone. There have to be other things that go with it, but it is something that manifests that there's something there. It can very well be used to establish authority. In fact, that's the reason that we accept science. You ask people, why do you believe science? Because it works, because it puts people on the moon. It cures diseases. In other words, the outcomes manifest that there is truth in this. There's something true about it, because if something lacks truth, it won't produce order or predictable results. But yet, when people live according to the gospel, there are certain outcomes that predictably follow. And that is a manifestation that there is something true about this. What exactly that is, what it validates, that's another discussion. But it does validate that at the very smallest level, if you're looking for spiritual truth, for the truth that brings about the highest level of being that you can have, you're going to have a hard time competing with with the theology of Christianity and more specifically the restored gospel. So that's kind of my rant.
That's what I was going to say. Like in an atheistic worldview, there cannot be any objective standard. I know you've talked about with Forrest, like, and you've talked about on your channel, like ultimate well-being versus ultimate suffering as a standard. I think that's really good. And I think as theists, we can refer to that because we have an outside being, the creator of the universe, telling us what that is. As an atheist, I've heard some atheists say, oh, like I could use that. I think even your brother once said in a comment to me on YouTube or something, that can't I just use Jacob's standard of well-being versus suffering, and that's my objective standard? And my response is no, because you don't even know what the ultimate goodness or well-being is. There's no way to know it. There's only a way to have your preference. Maybe there's a way to have your preference on what is ultimate well-being, but not an objective standard. So anyway, that's a whole other conversation.
That is definitely. Well, anyway, I wanted to just go over this thing for Forrest. I think that love my brother, great guy, but I thought it was interesting in this video and worth commenting on when he kind of moved away from the reductive materialism and towards what he calls an emergent world, but I don't think he quite understands the implications of it. But anyway, any final thoughts?
Nope, it's been good.
All righty. Well, take care, everybody. So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.